Recording the session. Oh, okay. So
yes, Sandhya.
We'll begin in just a minute. Need the last people to join. I hope you're having a great, wonderful Tuesday. Sorry, we usually have it on Mondays. Tuesday evening for a little webinar. Should be good. We have a very interesting speaker. Please remember to mute yourselves when you join. I think we will begin slowly and let people come in as they want. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Lupus Europe webinar on HTA. So what is HTA? Well, HTA, or Health Technology Assessment, aims to inform decision makers in health systems about which health technologies are of most value and should be invested in. So in our view, it's very important to involve patients in this process because they or we are the ones benefiting from the potential treatment or potential technology. And also with all the new medications for lupus in the pipeline, it couldn't be timed better than tonight, beginning tonight. So this webinar is the beginning of a theme we are counting on running in Lupus Europe during the next year or so, where we want to introduce you a lot more to HTA and how you can become involved. Tonight's speaker will tell you more about HTAs, what they are, and most importantly, how you can become involved with HTA within your respective healthcare systems. So a bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please ensure that your microphone and video are turned off. Remove all these squares from my screen so I can actually see it. Please turn your microphone and video on only if you are speaking. Please be aware that this session is recorded. Only use the raise hand function at the bottom middle of your screen. If you absolutely need to get our attention during the session, we will respond in chat. Please use the chat function to ask any questions or for any comments you may have. Please be patient with us. We will ensure your questions are answered. If you have any technical problems, try logging out from Zoom and logging back in. Now, I know that you will probably have some questions on the way, so you can either write them in the chat or you can ask them by unmuting yourself at the end of the session. So over to you, Amy.
So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Neil Bertelsen. Just a little bit about Neil. As a patient advocate in the 90s, Neil began his journey before the creation of health technology assessments. He was a patient advocate at a time before we had systems to assess, access, and reimbursement of medicines. He took those learnings and insights into his work as a consultant in the fields of global healthcare strategies, patient access, HTA policy, scientific and patient communications, advocacy relations, and patient insight research, allowing him to bring a unique set of perspectives together. Neil was a past chair of the Health Technology Assessment International, HTA, Patient and Citizen Involvement Group, where he is still an active member of the steering committee. This is a group of international experts, including patient organizations, HTA bodies, researchers and industry members that are determined to enable a future where patient and citizen involvement in the healthcare reimbursement decisions becomes the norm, not the exception. Neil is also a current board member of Patient-Focused Medicines Development, PFMD, where the focus is on working collaboratively and internationally across multiple stakeholders to make patient engagement in medicines a sustainable reality. So thank you, Neil.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Lupus Europe for inviting me here and for you all to listen to me today. And just give me a second while I just share my screen for you all. So hopefully this will work. And I'll just move the video here. So as Amy and Jeanette said, I'm going to be talking to you today about patient involvement in health technology assessment. And I really want to start by just explaining a bit more about the perspective that I'm bringing to you today. So as Amy said, I've worked with HTA bodies and regulators, with patient groups, with the industry, and with the research community. And through my work at Health Technology Assessment International, that's why we've been pushing forward better ways of involving patients in health technology assessment. I worked on a project called Paradigm, which was an EU-wide project looking at patient involvement in medicines development. But again, I focused on HTA there. That was really around working with these health technology assessment bodies to ensure that they're bringing patients into the early discussions they're having with drug developers. So that's a long time before a medicine becomes available, when the industry goes to health technology assessment bodies and says, can you give us some advice about the kinds of evidence we should be collecting? And we want to make sure that patients and patient groups are part of that process. So there's a range of tools and a paradigm that help HTA bodies get better at including patients there. And as Amy said, I also work with patient-focused medicines development. And there I work much more with the regulators as well as the health technology assessment bodies on making sure that we have a sort of global approach to patient involvement. I did start as a patient advocate back in the mid-90s, and I did spend a few years actually working within the industry. So I've sort of seen different sides of this equation during my career. But let's start. And what we want to do today is I'm going to take you through some basics. So for those of you that know about health technology assessment, I make no apologies from starting at the beginning. I think it's important that we all understand the basic purpose of health technology assessment. Then we'll talk about why patients need to be involved in this process. What is the rationale for making sure that patients are part of that decision-making process? We'll look at some examples, different ways that HTA bodies involve patients. And the last thing we'll do is I'll talk you through a couple of case studies that I think are good examples of where the patient community can bring new information into a HTA to make a difference. So let's start with the basics. So HTA, Health Technology Assessment. So those are the three letters. And the thing that trips a lot of people up are the first two, health technology. So what do we mean by a health technology? Well, it could be a medicine, it could be a medical device. These days, it could even be a digital app that you have on your smartphone. It's any technology that is designed to change the health state of somebody. But normally when we talk about HTA, the most common health technology that we're talking about is a medicine, a therapy, a drug. And the assessment is pretty clear. It's a way of assessing that health technology. The way this is done changes from country to country. So there is not one single way that this assessment happens. But in essence, they're all trying to do the same thing. They're looking at the international evidence about this new medicine or this new health technology and comparing it with what they currently have, what's currently used within our medical system in our country, and how does this new medicine look, how does it compare against what we have today? And the purpose of doing this is to make a decision. They want to decide, okay, should we be using and paying for this new medicine or this new health technology? If we do pay for it, how should we be using it? What's the best way of ensuring we get the best value for money by using it in a particular way? And often we're trying to identify in a HTA if there's any evidence that can help us understand which patients will benefit most from this new technology. So let's step back a second. Amy said, I started out being a patient advocate in a world before we had HTA. And now we have HTA in most countries. So the reason we had to invent HTA was, as you all know, we have a finite health resource in each of our countries, and that health resource is there to meet the needs of the whole population, not just for one disease. So the system has to decide who gets what. We don't have an endless pot of money, so we have to make choices. So they could do that by saying, okay, let's give the health resources, the money or the new treatments to those who shout the loudest, or those that have the best connections. Let's give them what they want. Or we could say, let's review the evidence and make a judgment based on the evidence that we have available. And it's that second option, option B, that is health technology assessment. So HTA is designed to be evidence-based rather than lobbying. It's designed to be a repeatable process, so you can do it over and over and over again for different diseases, different medicines, and everybody understands what that process is. So it's a standard process that's repeatable. They publish decisions and they tell you what methods they've used, what evidence they've looked at, and how they came to that decision. So the idea is that people such as us, we can look at those decisions that have been made and we can critique them. So although there's a lot of criticism about health technology assessment, one of its fundamental reasons for being is to give enough information so that you can criticize them. You can look and see what evidence they've used. So it's there to facilitate the fair allocation of healthcare budgets within countries and healthcare systems. But of course, if the evidence does not convince the HTA body that this treatment, this medicine is worth paying for, then it usually means that medicine is not available in the public healthcare system. It doesn't say anything about whether people can privately have prescriptions for that medicine, but in the public healthcare system, that's really where HTA is in force. So let's just stop for a second and say, okay, we've been talking about drugs and health technologies, but what health systems actually buy is health outcomes. They're actually not buying drugs. They're buying the health outcomes that those drugs or those technologies deliver. And therefore, it's the evidence behind those health technologies that count. It doesn't really matter whether it's a biologic drug or it's a small molecule that's in a pill or it's a gene therapy. It is the outcomes that matter to the healthcare system. So HTA tries to answer the question, does the evidence that's been presented to us convince us that we will get the health outcomes that have been promised? And do we believe that these health outcomes will make a difference? So you can see here, I'm already starting to point us to the fact that the evidence is the critical part of our HTA. And we need to think about why patient involvement can add value to that evidence. So when HTA bodies were first established towards the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, there were no real patient involvement processes. I know of only one HTA body that formed during that time that had any kind of patient involvement. And yet, when we get to today, most HTA bodies have some kind of patient involvement. It may not be perfect, but they have some kind of system. And if we go to 2017, just a few years ago, the man on the right here is called Brian O'Rourke. And he was at the time the president and CEO of the Canadian Health Technology Assessment Body. And I remember him getting up on stage at a big conference, talking to other HTA bodies and saying, if you're not involving patients, you really are not doing HTA. You have to involve patients to do good HTA. So why is that? Why do HTA bodies involve patients? Well, let's go back to what they tried to do in the beginning. As I've said, they didn't really include patients at the beginning. So they say to the industry, the drug company, you give us the evidence. And the company says, here's our evidence, and it shows that we have clear clinical value and economic value. And the HTA body says, okay, this should be quite simple. We can do this. We go to the clinicians, the doctors, and we ask them what they think. And we go to the economists and we ask them what they think. So the clinicians, we want to know, does this new treatment bring something new that we don't have already? And to the economists, we want to know, what are the impacts of providing, in terms of costs, of providing healthcare with this new treatment? And then they pull all of those viewpoints together and they make a decision. Except it turns out not to be that easy, because when you have a new treatment, actually you have a lot of holes in the evidence. The clinical studies are providing only part of the story. I'm listing here just a few of the things that are problems with the evidence that's provided. So the clinical studies, maybe the people involved in those studies, the clinical trial participants, may not really reflect the kinds of patients you see in the real world. Maybe the study length is too short to know actually how long this medicine may work or what its longer term benefits may have. Many clinical studies today include quality of life and patient-reported outcome measures. And these can be really hard to understand in a HTA. You often have missing data with patient-reported outcomes. And one of the big problems that I see today is for different diseases, you often have a lot of different patient-reported outcomes tools. One company might use one tool, another company might use another tool. And that makes it really challenging to compare different treatments when they've all used different tools. And it's also a challenge for the HTA bodies to keep up to speed with all of these different patient-reported outcome tools and how they can and can't help in their decision-making. The big problem that we often have with the evidence at a HTA is what does the evidence compare the new treatment to? So often the evidence is missing any kind of evidence that links its performance to what's currently the best alternative in a country. And certainly in a disease area where you have a lot of new treatments coming one after another, it means that quite quickly the clinical trials will not reflect the treatments that are currently in use because they're all too new. So they weren't included in the clinical studies that immediately followed them. So you have a lot of problems about how you compare this new treatment to what's currently available. And in HTA terms, they call these uncertainties. So this creates, I talked earlier about this challenge between what's being promised. We promise that this new treatment will give you all of these great things. But what does the evidence show? Does the evidence back up that promise? And there's always a gap there. And the bigger that gap, we say in HTA terms, the bigger the uncertainties. We're not certain that we're going to get what we've been promised. So the traditional approach breaks down and you get questions like, what's the meaningful benefits to patients? Which of these outcomes in this clinical study are most important? What should we as a committee focus on? Are there particular subpopulations that we need to understand more because they have different needs that maybe are affected in terms of this treatment? And sometimes you have treatments that are based on diseases where you have disease scores that are measuring, how severe somebody is experiencing that disease, and they can be really hard to understand and interpret and what they really mean for patients. Sometimes you have treatments that say, we are going to transform the way this disease is treated in the healthcare system. And so HTA bodies sometimes have to ask the question, okay, if this is a truly transformative treatment that's going to change clinical practice, what is that change? What's the impact of that change on patients? It's not always good. Sometimes some of those changes can be problematic for patients. And ultimately, they want to say who will benefit most from this technology and what is the real value of this treatment. They never really can answer that last question fully, but they're trying to get as close to the answer as they can. And so patients are the missing link in these deliberations. They can explain the impact of the condition on their daily lives, translate the endpoints and the different measures that have been used in a clinical trial into specific, meaningful impacts that they experience every day. So they highlight the positive impact that potentially a change in these measures or outcomes or endpoints would have on their lives. And they can clearly articulate with specifics how their needs are not being met with the current treatments and standards of care. And you'll see on this slide, you'll see I've underlined the word specific several times. And you'll hear me keep saying that throughout this presentation, that actually the real value of patient involvement in HTA is when patients bring specific knowledge, specific experience and examples into those discussions. We looked at this at HTAI. So we did a big study around the world with different stakeholders and tried to understand what was the value of having patient involvement in HTA. And the number one, I won't go through all of these, but the number one was that patients have unique knowledge, relevant knowledge, and perspectives that can help inform the decision, that can help the quality of that decision. And this unique knowledge, nobody else around the table has that knowledge. And so it's really important that there's an opportunity for patients, patient advocates to express that knowledge within a health technology assessment process. But patient involvement is not about ensuring a yes. This is a common misunderstanding. Patients are given objective view of how a new therapy meets their needs or doesn't meet their needs. And what I've seen over the years I've been working in this area is that patients who are experienced in this process can be just as critical of the evidence provided as the other stakeholders, just as critical as the doctors or the economics experts. And a phrase I hear quite a lot from people who've been through a lot of these HTA processes, patient advocates who've been through these processes is they say, do you know what, we do need new medicines. We definitely need new medicines, but that doesn't mean we'll take any medicine and not at any price. So you can see here that it's about ensuring that quality of decision-making. It's important the patient perspective is included, but it's not about lobbying for a yes. It's about helping make the best decision that we can with the evidence that we have available. So let's move on to how do health technology assessment bodies involve patients? Well, I said before, there's no single way of doing this. There's a lot of different methods used. And some of this comes down to legal systems, social systems. So different health technology assessment bodies have different legal remits within their healthcare system. Some of them make recommendations. Some of them are just advisory bodies. Some of them actually make decisions. So the remit of the HTA body actually determines, if you like, the processes they will use and also the way that they will involve patients. A critical one is not every health technology assessment body has the same resources as another one. In some countries, you have whole departments that are devoted to patient involvement. And in other HTA bodies, they just simply do not have the resources to have even one person involved, in charge of patient involvement. So resources within different countries can be a real limit on patient involvement. I think it's important also that we don't all live in the same society, in the same culture. And in some countries, there's a different level of hierarchy or a different understanding of what is the role of patients. And so we cannot expect to have a one-size-fits-all patient involvement approach. And we see that across the world. We see different methods used in different countries based on what that society is used to in terms of consulting with the public. There's a range of methods. There's more than what's on this slide. And I would say that they're often mixed together. So it's not that one does one of these things, but not the others, but actually you usually find a mix of these different approaches. You can have informal discussions. So a HTA body can say, we've got a treatment in front of us, and we've never looked at a treatment for this disease before. So we have absolutely no knowledge of what patients go through to be treated for this disease, and we need to know that. And so they may not have a patient involvement process, but they may reach out to patient organizations to help them understand the disease when there is a difficult decision ahead of them and they need more information. In some countries, they have these open public consultations, usually on a website, where patients, physicians, members of the public, nurses can comment on a HTA process, and they analyze all those comments and take those views in. Quite a common process these days is having a formal process where patient groups, not individual patients, but patient groups usually, produce written submissions to input into a HTA process. So just as the company developing the medicine will give a dossier of information saying, this is all the information about our new medicine, at the same time, patient groups will be giving information in as well, saying this is our perspective of this particular disease area and this particular medicine that you need to consider alongside the other evidence that you're being given. And in many systems, not all, you can have representation at committee meetings, either as patient experts or patient groups, to give testimony to the committee meeting and to answer any questions that the committee may have. And in terms of a general approach, I'm just going to flick through this one, but I'll do it step by step. A long time before a medicine comes to HTA, they'll look and they'll say, do you know what? 6 months from now, we're going to have a new treatment for lupus in front of us. And it's a long, long time since we've looked at lupus. We haven't looked at lupus in ages. So we need to understand in this scoping phase, we need to understand more about how patients experience lupus and its current treatment. So when the disease is less familiar to the HTA body, they may initiate this scoping phase. It doesn't always happen. And in this scoping phase, they often have consultations and workshops with patient groups to find out more about the disease and to help them understand what are the critical questions they should be thinking about during the HTA. Then you have the actual HTA process itself, which starts with the evidence submission. So the industry, the drug company gives their evidence into the HTA. And at the same time, for a lot of HTA bodies, they'll invite patient organizations to actually write evidence and submit that to the committee as well. In some jurisdictions, they also ask patient experts to provide evidence. Sometimes depends on the process. Then you have the committee meeting. So this is the real meeting where everyone's read all the evidence and they've got their thoughts together. You have doctors there, you have economists there, you have people representing the citizen, the public, if you like, there as well as the experts on HTA and the drug company. And usually it's quite common these days that you have patient experts invited to that and patient groups invited to that to answer questions or to be able to give some clarity to any thoughts that have come up during that meeting. From that committee meeting, there'll be a consultation. The consultation will say, this is what we think our decision is going to be. And usually, anybody who's been involved in the process up till now is invited to feedback in that consultation. But what doesn't normally happen is you get another patient group that hasn't been involved in this at all that is allowed to, to be part of that consultation. So this is really a consultation between all the people that have been involved in the HTA so far. You usually have a second committee meeting, which sort of finalizes the recommendation, and then that's published. And you have patient involvement throughout this process. And if there's a real feeling that the committee have made a mistake in their recommendation, most systems allow you to appeal that recommendation. And the kinds of questions HTA bodies ask of patient groups is, how does your condition affect day-to-day lives of people living with it? So can you tell us more, be more specific about the condition itself? And how well do medicines, which are currently available, so not the new medicine, but the technologies, the way of treating the disease currently, how does that work? Does that really manage the condition? What are the pluses and the minuses with the way the disease is currently managed? The third question is really hard to answer unless in your country there have been clinical trials for the new medicine. But question 3 is basically saying, has the patient organization who's providing this evidence, have they been able to speak to anybody who's actually taken this new medicine? You know, do they have any insights on somebody who's actually perhaps been on a clinical trial that's able to really share what their experience of the medicine is? Then the fourth question is sort of a guesswork question, but based on what we know so far, does the patient group think this medicine will be expected to improve patients' lives, experience of care, and exactly how do we think it will improve it? Some HTA bodies, not all, some ask question 5, what kind of impact would this new medicine have on the patient's family or carers? Some go even further than this. So in Sweden and places like that, you often get questions around how will this benefit society? So thinking even more broadly than that. Question 6 is really important. And if you're involved in this process, don't skip question 6. There is no medicine ever invented to this day that has no downsides, okay? And so question 6 is just trying to understand from the patient perspective, what are going to be the disadvantages of this new medicine? It might be great at controlling the disease, but there may be challenges, I don't know, in the way that it's administered or the frequency that it's given, or that whatever it may be, it's important when you're inputting to a HTA that you don't skip question 6 because it looks a bit suspicious, to be honest. If you're a patient group saying, this medicine is so perfect that we couldn't think of any single thing to say to answer question 6, it's a bit sort of like, okay, maybe you could have thought a bit more about that one. But what do HTA bodies not want from this input? So what goes wrong when patient groups are inputting into HTA? We see quite a lot of cases where the patient group spends a lot of time and resources searching for the clinical studies and the scientific evidence, going back, looking at the phase 1 trial results, almost building a dossier of the clinical evidence that has been generated so far. And they put that into their submission. And that takes up valuable space from their submission. But the HTA body get this scientific evidence from the industry and from the clinicians and from the health economists. They're not looking to the patient organizations to provide them with this information. They get it already. So you've wasted most of your submission by repeating evidence that they've got already. Sometimes patient groups find other comments that have happened from press releases, from articles in magazines and journals, and they reword info from other sources that aren't patient sources. You know, sometimes you might get something like, oh, in this nurse magazine, a nurse was interviewed about this new treatment and said X, Y, and Z. They're not interested in what nurses think. That's not why you've been invited into the process. They're interested in what patients think. The third one, I get a lot of pushback from patient groups about this third one, but I really mean it. You know, every HTA, when you have a patient organization there, could sound the same if you're not careful. It doesn't matter what disease it is. Nobody likes living with or experiencing their particular condition. And if you just say, living with this condition is really terrible, it really affects my day every day. We're desperate for new treatments for this condition. They hear those same words about every single disease area. So what you need to do is okay to have emotion. It's okay to explain why the disease is so difficult to live with, and explain what that effect is on you and other patients living with that disease. But you need those specifics in there. I mentioned this before. You need to be specific about why that is so challenging. What is it about your day-to-day life that is interrupted by the disease or the condition? And repeated messages, which is pretty self-explanatory. In the time available, I just want to take you 2 cases to bring this to life for you. So this was a rare disease looking at treating something called lipodystrophy, very expensive treatment. And yet, this was an example, I think a really clear example, where there was a particular impact of the disease that was not being mentioned by the other stakeholders. So it's a rare conditions. The disease was poorly understood by the HTA body. So a classic case where patient involvement can actually really help understanding. All the other stakeholders, like the clinicians and the company, were focusing on how this new medicine changed laboratory values, such as liver enzymes, blood sugar, triglycerides. So it's very technical discussion about lab values and how they change with or without the new treatment. For the patient group, they said, hold on a second here, our biggest problem with this disease, you haven't even mentioned. It's something called hyperphagia, which is like a severe hunger. And the patients talked about this a lot at this committee meeting. They talked about this feeling of starvation that they have. They talked about the way that it has both physical and psychological impacts on them every day of their life. They were able to explain in detail how it affects their professional life, how it affects their social life. They said it's fine. Everyone says, oh, you just need to control your diet. But when you have this intense hunger all the time, it's impossible to stick to a diet. So they really explained to the committee how this one symptom was controlling their whole life. And it changed the focus of the discussion, the committee meeting. The committee agreed that the disease did have a substantial impact on quality of life. And they recommended that the medicine could be used as an option. And the learnings from this case, I think, are that this personal testimony can have an impact when you're specific. Again, I'm talking about specifics. The patients were able to give details of the specific aspects of the symptoms on their mental health, quality of life, and their ability to undertake everyday activities. They were able to make the committee aware that the key patient issue really hadn't been measured in the clinical studies, wasn't even in the economic model that's developed by the company, but it should still be considered. And they were able to bring a patient survey to the table as well that was able to substantiate the points of view that had been raised. And this is all in the public domain. So you can click on the links at the bottom, you get a copy of the slides, and you can see the actual evidence that was presented to the committee. The second one I want to talk about is how a patient perspective can change opinions on where the value is for a new therapy. So this was a new biologic for a chronic disease called ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. The evidence showed that, yeah, this treatment would work for a time. It wasn't expected to work forever. We didn't really know how long it would work for, but we knew that without this treatment, people suffering from ulcerative colitis would end up having surgery. They have part of their bowel removed, and then they have a bag on the side of their body that they have to live with for the rest of their lives. So the surgery itself has a lifelong quality of life impact. And this kind of decision for HTA is really hard because we didn't think the treatment would prevent surgery forever. It would only delay it. So what's the benefit? Because the cost to the system would go up. You're paying for the medicine, and you're eventually also going to be paying for the surgery. And the long-term impacts on patients could be argued to be unchanged because patients would eventually need the surgery. So they would eventually have this bag, and there would eventually be no change for them from their state, despite the fact that they'd had this treatment. But the patient group submissions and the experts in the committee meeting will really express some strong views that surgery for many patients is just not an acceptable treatment option, that no matter how intense the symptoms get, that's not an option for some people. Particularly, it's unacceptable for young people. Often when these symptoms get intense, people are still quite young. They might be studying, going to university for the first time. They may be starting their career or have met somebody and be starting a family. There's a specific problem that the surgery can cause infertility in women. And so that means that that's a real difficult decision there in front of a woman who wants to have children in the future, then probably can't have the surgery. But these concepts really hadn't been discussed by the other stakeholders. So in the end, the committee agreed that surgery was not an acceptable option for some patients, and treatment was recommended for reimbursement. Same kinds of learnings, personal testimony with specifics, clear examples of the types of patients that could most benefit, clarity on the impacts on day-to-day life, and specifics on how delaying a surgery could have a lifelong impact. And I'm going to stop there. I've given you a lot to think about. Yes, and I'm almost on time. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now.
You're great on timing. Thank you so much. I think it was a really, really great presentation. Very clear. Didn't have a lot of questions, but luckily I have some. So I think it's a really good introduction to the theme, and it really shows the importance of involving patients in HTA. So thank you so much for that. I think you might have answered the question already, but Andreas asked, is there an HTA Europe, or does each country has its own?
That's actually quite a difficult question to answer right now because we're in the middle of a transition. So until now, HTA bodies are national bodies. So they operate independent of each other and they make decisions independent of each other. There has been a move within the European Union, so countries of the European Union, to harmonize HTA. And it looks like that will now go ahead, but it's still not a HTA for Europe. So what they've done is they've said, we're going to split the HTA decision-making into two steps. The first step will be something called relative clinical effectiveness. So that is a step that is designed to answer the question, what clinically does this new treatment bring us that we didn't have before? And the idea is that that will happen on the European-wide level. So instead of that being repeated in each country, it'll happen once on the European level. But the second step is still national under this new idea. And so that's the health economic section. You know, what do we think the costs of the new treatment will be? Do we think it's worth paying for? That final cost decision and determination will happen still in each separate country.
Yeah. That also reminds me that when we hear, for instance, of a new medication coming in, we just heard of medication being approved at the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in the US, and now it's getting approved by the EMA, the European Medicines Agency. So what does that mean when it gets accepted at the EMA? Is that sort of also a European acceptance, or?
Yeah, so there's two gates. In order for the medicine to be available to you, there's two gates it has to go through, broadly speaking. It, first of all, has to prove that its efficacy and safety are acceptable. That's what the European Medicines Agency does. So they're not really saying, does this bring us benefits that we don't have already? They're not asking that question. They're saying, from the data available, do we think that this treatment does more good than harm? And based on that decision, they approve it. If they think it does more good than harm, then it gets approved. That just means that it's legally able to be sold in Europe. What the HTA body is doing is saying, okay, legally we can now have access to this drug, but do we want to spend our health money on accessing this drug? And that's the second step, the HTA step.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much. So Andreas has another question. Is HTA a one-off assessment? So what happens if you have a new treatment? Are the previous one then reassessed, or how does it work?
Oh God, this is a really good question, actually. So it used to be more or less a one-step thing. So it used to be, you have your HTA assessment, and that was pretty much done. But for all of the things that you've just said and Andreas has said, what tends to happen, even for a treatment, forget what else happens with new medicines coming, but just for a new treatment, it usually gets assessed, and there's all these uncertainties I talked about before. And so they'll say, do you know what? We will make this available for a particular group of patients, which is probably quite a small group of patients, because we're not yet convinced that it has value. And then 2 years from now, we'll reassess this. We'll look at any new evidence. And so you normally have a 2 or 3 year reassessment window between these different timestamps. But you're right, what also some HTA bodies do is when you suddenly have a lot of new treatments that have come within a few years within a disease area, they might look at those treatments all together. So each one will have a single review, but at some point they might say, do you know what, we have to look at these all together and make some decisions about which ones we should use first, those kinds of things. So both of those things happen.
Okay. So when do patients get involved? When do national HTA bodies typically involve patients? Is it during the clinical trial? Is it when it's complete, or when the EMA has approved the treatment?
So legally, in many countries, the HTA can't start work until it's had European Medicines Agency approval. So that's usually the trigger for them to start their work. And their work depends on the country, but their work can take 6 months, a year, some countries much longer than that, which is why you sometimes have this big delay from one country to another about the availability of a new medicine. When should patients be involved? It depends on the process. But I'd say most of the time, they will pre-announce it on their website. So France is very good at this, for example. So HAS, the French body, they have a process where they say, okay, upcoming health technology assessment will be these diseases, these drugs on these particular dates. And they try to give enough warning to the patient community to say, be ready to input. The input process is usually quite narrow. It's usually between 2 and 6 weeks before the actual meeting, depends on the country. And patient groups have to come with a lot of information in that short space of time. So looking ahead at your local national HTA body and saying, do they pre-announce when they're going to do these reviews, will help you get prepared. And then really from that moment on, in a good patient involvement process, you should be involved at every step of the way until the final decision is made.
Yeah, so it's a good time now to be preparing in the organizations for things that might be coming on lupus, for instance.
Exactly.
So how are the patients then selected? How do the...
Yeah, so it's not, there's different processes at different points in time, but the main one we've been talking about today is when a medicine is assessed.
Yes.
And most HTA bodies do not invite individual patients there. What they're doing is they're going to the patient groups to ask the patient groups, can you provide the evidence? And the reason they do that is they want to separate putting somebody under pressure as an individual to represent a whole community. And where possible, say, there's a patient organization that is already connected to the community that is ideally placed to bring that in. Usually you have to be a patient group that's registered or a charity, those kinds of things. So an official patient group, you apply usually to be on their list. You tell them what disease area you're in and your contact details, and you usually have to fill in a form to register with them. Once you're on their list, they should email you when it comes close to a particular assessment you might be interested in. So they don't select in the way of like, we'll have you, but not you. What they do is they invite anybody who's registered in that disease area will get an invite.
So the patients groups represented today out there, how do they seek out their national HTA bodies? Do you have any suggestions of anything they should search on, or any place they should go?
Okay, yes.
Website or something.
So most HTA bodies have a website. If they have patient involvement, not all do, I have to be honest, they don't all do this. If they have patient involvement, there's usually a section there it might be called partnerships, or it might be how can you get involved, or within your own language. Sometimes they use words like our engagement processes. They use different words in different countries, obviously translated. In that section, they'll probably have a section that says, as a physician, as a doctor, how can you be involved in our decisions? As a patient organization, how can you be involved? And there's good guidance out there. So many HTA bodies actually have really clear videos, in some cases, or really clear infographics that say, this is the process in this country, and this is when we would involve you. This is what we would expect from you. That doesn't happen in your country. One of the organizations I represent, HTA International, they have a patient and citizens involvement group website. You can just go to htai.org, patient and citizens involvement group. There's a lot of resources there that will give you a lot of background on HTA and how to be involved.
I'm also thinking about the EUPATI website, because we have many national EUPATI platforms where you can get more information also about what HTA is. Yeah.
Exactly. Really good resources at EUPATI, yes.
Which brings me to the next question. So what qualifications or skills do you think patients should have to be able to work with HTA bodies?
So I think the mistake that we make as the patient community is we start to assume that we need to be on a equal technical footing as the other stakeholders. And actually, what we need is to be able to clearly express the patient perspective in a way that has weight and has value in those discussions. So I think clear, concise communication is the key skill. If you're in a committee meeting with lots of people talking, you don't have long to get your point across. It is really getting to the heart of why is this needed, or why is there a problem with current treatments? What specifically needs fixing? It's getting to the heart of those discussions very quickly in a way that engages the other people around the table, that reflects the evidence you've heard. That's the skill, I would say. Yes, it's really good when you've had training, so you can shortcut understanding some of the terminology that's used. And it's always good to know before you go into a meeting, is there any terminology that I need to be familiar with? But you certainly don't need to be an expert into all of those things. And I would argue, actually, that you're expert as a patient expert or patient advocate that's spoken to so many people with this condition. That's what they're looking for. That's the understanding they want.
So an understanding of the disease and the impact it has on your life, and then maybe being a bit outspoken and able to express those concerns.
Exactly.
Okay. So Anne-Marie is asking, if you as a patient have are involved with an industry or have been at some point. You can't work with the EMA. So how is it with HTA bodies? Could you have been working with the industry at some point and still be working with them?
It's often not as strict, but it depends on the country. So it's always worth checking the rules before you make any decision about who to get involved with, okay? And the rules change over time. What I would say is that there is a declaration. If you're submitting information to a HTA, they will ask a series of questions up front, trying to understand where your funding comes from and what is your connection to the industry in general, and your connection to this particular company that's under review, which is a product that's under review. And they will not necessarily exclude patient groups that have that connection, but it certainly, I think, does change the weighting, you know, when you think about it.
Okay. So, yeah, just thinking, well, lupus is a very heterogeneous disease, so no two patients are the same, and that is, it often complicates matters. It makes it difficult for one patient to know the entire community. Is there any way to, have you have any advice of how to prepare, how to handle this going into the discussions?
This is true in some diseases, some other diseases outside of lupus as well. I know, and one of the things that helps is evidence. So when you have such a heterogeneous population, then that's calling out for some, can be a patient survey or can be something more complicated than that, depending on your resources, but something that helps understand what that spectrum looks like. What's the spectrum of symptoms? How do those different symptoms affect different people? Is there a way of highlighting particular groups of people that have the more severe symptoms, or you know, whatever it turns out to be for lupus's case? But that really, it really helps to be able to quantify the sort of patient experience in that way, if possible. And that can be done on the European level. It doesn't have to be done multiple times in each country. You can use European evidence in most HTA approaches.
Yeah, which I really love that you said that, because we can only encourage people to use our own survey, the Living with Lupus survey that we did last year, where we have a lot of evidence-based information from lupus patients all around Europe. So we have almost 6,000 answers on the specific things that the specific issues they have with their disease. So great tool to use. Just as a finishing comment, Amy is saying that she has a close friend who has Crohn's disease, and her treatment actually was improved by the biologic that was approved, and she's only 24. So I'm sure that she really appreciates being able to postpone that time where she has to have the surgery and have a lot better quality of life because of it. So like really shows how important this work is.
Yeah.
So I think we've run out.
Oh, Jeanette, I think we've lost you.
You're frozen, Jeanette.
Yeah, I think Jeanette was frozen suddenly with her last comment. So I think I'll just take a relay quickly here. And thank you. This was really fascinating. It's great to have you there explaining and giving all that feedback from experience, which is really what we needed. And so, Jeanette, you're back.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm sorry.
Wonderful. So I'll let you continue. Just go.
No, but we're done. It's just wanted to say thank you, and I think that you already have. So, Alan, thank you so much. And as you also mentioned, your slides will be available afterwards, so people can receive them. And of course, if anyone is interested in the recording that we made tonight, that can also be made available if you just write an email to Zoe at zoe@lupuseurope.org, and she will send it on to you. If you have any other questions or comments from tonight's talk, you can also send it to Zoe. So thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, Neil, for a great presentation and great opening of this topic.
Oh no, thank you for inviting me, and have a good evening, everybody.
Take care, Neil. Thank you so much.
Take care.